Welcome this snowy afternoon at 3:30 on a Wednesday. Today we have our second inaugural lecture in honor of Fred Johnson. Fred Johnson was promoted to full professor last year, and so we are here to celebrate him. Yes. As the interim dean for Arts and Humanities, I have the job of introducing Fred Johnson, which scares me. And you'll know why after you hear him talk if you haven't heard him speak before, but I'd rather introduce him than follow him. So, Fred, I want to share with you my first memory of you. It was in 2010, I was a new faculty member here, and I was sitting in the teaching enhancement workshop. And Fred gave a talk called Enthuse Them or Lose Them. Do you remember this talk? The first talk at the Teaching Enhancement Workshop, which I was ensured by the people that were running this was necessary because teaching was at a higher standard here at Hope than perhaps I was used to. I listened to Fred's talk, and I thought, is everybody at Hope like this? Because that's bad news for me. Well, they are, but Fred is actually really special because Fred is both a fantastic scholar for a wide academic audience, but he also publishes and speaks to the wider public about important historical matters. Fred has served in the Marine Corps. He has been a recognized award-winning speaker with Toastmasters. Fred has published biographies of popular figures like Tupac Shakur and scholarly articles on Civil War and the railroad. Fred, to me, is someone that I admire and have admired literally from my first day here at Hope, and I'm so glad that he will speak here today on, what is the name of your talk here? The Uncertain Journey, American Democracy, Troubling Trends, and a Warning. So I'm going to get off the stage before I embarrass myself further and hand it over to Fred.
Thank you, Steve. And good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. What does a nearly kidnapped Michigan governor in the state of Michigan, the big lie from the 2020 election, an insurrection against the U.S. Capitol, and George Washington all have in common? They have in common the legacy, the tradition of this troubled journey of American Republican democracy that we're also upon, some troubling trends that has been part of it, and the warning that we need to heed because of it. George Washington was the supreme commander of the Continental Army from 1775 until the treaty at the end of the war in 1783. Washington was a man of integrity, character, and courage, but had some major defects as well. But one thing that he did love, George Washington loved democracy. He truly did. And in 1796, as he came to the end of his second term in office, he drafted a farewell address that, among other things, warned the United States to not get involved in foreign entanglements. But there were some other things he said in that farewell that gave a warning about what to do to preserve the democracy at home. The farewell address is filled with warning. It kind of puts us in the memory of James Madison, who, during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary." Reading on, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. The founding fathers were nothing if not skeptical of human nature. They had lived through the worst of it. They had seen what people could do. They had seen what happens when power gets into the hands of the wrong people. So they were putting safeguards in to make sure that power would be in the hands of the right people that if it ever fell into the hands of the wrong people, that there will be checks and balances to remedy the situation or mitigate the impact. Then we had to fast forward from George Washington until January 6, 2021, the date of the Capitol insurrection.
America first! America first!
Another thing I would say, Lester, is, as we try to figure out, well, it looks now like the Capitol, the police have been
Pete, let me
unable to
break
hold
away
these
from you a
people back.
second because things are happening very quickly.
The government did this to us. We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens.
They no longer have been able to keep them back.
The first time that the Capitol in Washington, D.C. was threatened was during the War of 1812 when the British burned it to the ground. The second time that the Capitol was threatened was during the Civil War. In the summer of 1864, General Robert E. Lee, Supreme Commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, dispatched General Jubal Anderson Early to raid Washington, D.C. On July 11, 1864, Early got to within 7 miles of Washington, D.C., no closer. He looked out across the ramparts and saw that the city was too heavily defended and simply took his journey back south. The Confederate flag on that raid and the entire Civil War from 1861 to 1865 never, ever made it inside of the Capitol. The third time that the Capitol was threatened was on 9/11, the day of the September 11, 2001 terror attacks on the World Trade Center. But in addition to the World Trade Center in New York City being attacked, the Pentagon was also attacked before and after. Over 150 people lost their lives when that plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon. But it withstood all of that, the Capitol did, and it took until January 6, 2021, the 21st century, for the Confederate flag, a symbol of oppression and slavery and bigotry, to finally make it inside of the people's house. I don't know about you all, but as I sat there looking at that morning, or frankly throughout the day, at what was going on at the Capitol, I kept asking myself, how did we get to this? How is it possible in the United States of America, for all of our differences, for all of our challenges, and we have many differences and many challenges, but how did we get to this? An actual assault upon the Capitol. And as I thought about this over the last few months, as an historian, of course, I see things through an historical point of view, and it seems to me that the assault on January 6, 2021 is a result of American history's trends and some traditions, which when you put them together, it's not a question of how could it happen, but given those trends and traditions, how could it not have happened? In our historical memory, in our historical trends, in our traditions, we have a history of mob violence. Mob violence, we also have not only just mob violence, but people who feel entitled to commit mob violence. That they have some type of God-given right to respond and impose their will through this particular method. Throughout our history, we have shown a tolerance for injustice. Throughout American history, that tolerance for injustice has included harassment, people being harassed, intimidated, having their voting rights denied or curtailed, and sometimes even being murdered. Here it is, with no consequences. Now, when you have people who are being harassed and intimidated and having their voting rights curtailed, abridged, and even sometimes murdered, and there are no consequences, what you have done effectively is over time created a culture of impunity where the people who perpetrate this kind of stuff, they do it and get away with it, and they're sure they can get away with it. And how do they know they can get away with it? Because they get away with it over and over and over again. So therefore, they're enabled and feel empowered that the next time they do it, they'll do what? Get away with it yet one more time. And for the people who they target, it doesn't really matter if the people who are targeted them say that they live in a democratic republic. For the people who are being targeted, harassed, intimidated, having their voting rights curtailed or wiped out, or sometimes being murdered, but there being no consequences, that effectively adds up to a situation where they're living in a state of tyranny in the midst of a democracy. We call ourselves one thing, but the practical effect is that for the people who are in those communities, they're living in a tyranny environment. And it goes back to the beginning. In the beginning, the United States, as a young colonial nation, made a devil's agreement, a devil's bargain, that included the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In fact, it preceded the Declaration of Independence. Some of the colonial slave laws included, among other things, these two that I haven't read, which to me, if you put them together, they kind of sum up the dismal nature of all the rest of them. For example, take the one in Virginia in 1662. Children would take on the status of the mother. That law was passed to enslave increasing numbers of children fathered by white men. Now, several things going on here. First of all, we're talking about a time where there's no law against raping a black woman. Shall we be naive and think that if there's no law against raping somebody, that somehow that will lessen it or encourage it? No, we're not going to be that naive. So what this does, though, is that it takes on some cosmic features in that this says that a child in utero who has not taken his first breath of air yet, whose feet have not hit the earth yet, whose sunlight has not even hit, the first ray of sunlight has not even hit their face yet, that child is doomed to a life of perpetual servitude on the basis of their mother. And then the last one, past the 1740, black people trying to leave the colony of South Carolina to escape to Spanish Florida because the authorities of Spanish Florida said, if you come down here, we'll give you land, we'll educate you, and we'll let you live free. These slaves may have been illiterate, but they were not unintelligent. They knew a good deal when they heard one. Being someplace where somebody's going to give you free land and education and leave you alone, as opposed to being harassed and in bondage, sounded a lot better than where they were, so they went. People tried to stop them. They, of course, fought back. It was called a rebellion because they fought back. The year after, they passed something called the Negro Act, which essentially said slaves were prohibited from gathering in groups, earning money, learning to read or raise food, and gave slave owners the right to kill rebellious slaves. Again, I ask you, if you live in an environment where people can kill you and there's no consequences, does that not perpetuate a culture of impunity? What else can you do to someone in life if you can take their life and nothing happened to you? During the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, the devil's bargain was extended one more time. Now look, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, is some of the best political philosophy that you'll find in the Atlantic world in North America in any time in our history. The preamble reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." It is a wonderful beginning. It really is. I read that many years before I had one thought. In 1787, who's we? In 1787, we does not include Native Americans. In 1787, we does not include women, poor white men. In 1787, we does not include women. In 1787, we absolutely does not include black people. It turns out that in 1787, we includes a very narrow slice of the population, which frankly excludes most white people as well. We is indeed a very small club in 1787. So as I pondered this, I said, how do you go from a nation that is founded in freedom, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, to borrow from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and end up with a system of slavery? How do you do that as an institutionalized, codified system that is not just established and growing, but thriving and profiting? How do you do that? It turns out that the devil's bargain, to get specific about it, included a nod to create a system of tyranny. a bargain with tyranny, the tyranny of slavery. Because slavery in North America was nothing if not an existence of tyranny where people's every waking moment, I cannot stress this enough, there was never a time, never a moment of the day, no space, not the marriage bed, not the prayer closet, nowhere where slavery did not intrude. John J. Chapman, a biographer of William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, said there was never a moment during this time, the Constitutional Convention, when the slavery issue was not a sleeping serpent. That issue lay coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Likewise, the serpent lay coiled beneath the cross of Christianity, at least the way it was practiced American style. No one better than Frederick Douglass articulates what that meant. In his narrative that he published in 1845, Frederick Douglass, the former slave who escaped to freedom and had to go to England to raise money raise enough money so that his former master would finally leave him alone, he said, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land and Christianity. I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me." In Scripture, the Master Jesus is accused at one point of being in league and working with the devil. And Jesus kind of responds by, what are you, stupid? A kingdom that's doing that can't stand. Later on in 1858, Abraham Lincoln in his famous House Divided speech will say, "A house divided cannot stand." How long can a country go on like this, being both dedicated to slavery and dedicated to freedom as well? If you fast forward to 1820, the strains of that kind of delicate dissonance showed itself when the Missouri Territory applied for statehood to join the Union. I won't take you through all the details. Let's just say that the issue of slavery came up one more time. And this time, although it had been a thorn in people's side and people knew about it, and it was generally repugnant and generally something that people didn't want to deal with, and now it became a national debate that for the first time, people began using two words together that shook people to their foundations, two words which were civil war. This had the ability to bring great harm upon the nation. Retired, back on his plantation in Monticello, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, long out of office in 1820, even he caught wind of what was going on all the way out there in the hinterlands of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his friend John Holmes lamenting the fact that the slavery issue was going to tear the nation apart. And in that letter he said to John Holmes, he said, "We have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go." You see, it would have been one thing if Jefferson had just said, "We can't let him go," but he qualified it. He said, "We can't safely let him go." America already by 1820 was between the rock and a hard place. We can't safely let him go. In the 1840s and 1850s, that culture of impunity, that tendency toward mob violence turned its attention toward Irish Catholics who were coming to America in large numbers because of the potato famine in Ireland. Those alligator-looking creatures that you see crawling ashore are actually people in papal vestments who are made to look like alligators coming ashore, threatening American school children in the foreground and doing all other kind of nefarious things. On April 12, 1861, the uneasy existence between tyranny and freedom finally gave way with the start of the American Civil War. That lasted for 4 years, and with the surrender of General Robert E. Lee on April 9, 1865, to General Ulysses S. Grant in Wilmer McLean's living room at Appomattox Courthouse, the great beast slavery was finally slain. I tell the students this about slavery and the Civil War. This is how I know that slavery was going nowhere, no time soon. Warfare, whenever we do it, is the most violent thing that human beings have ever done to each other, whether it be with rocks and sticks, whether it be with pikes and swords, whether it be with with machine guns, whether it be with nuclear weapons, whenever we do war, whenever we're doing it, that is the most violent thing we're doing in that moment. And so it took slavery was a violent system established in violence, spread in violence, maintained in violence, and nurtured by violence. And it took a system of equal and greater violence to once and for all get rid of the violent thing. That's how we knew it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. It is the same reason why Frederick Douglass declined to join John Brown on October 16, 1859, when Brown invited him to come on the raid at Harper's Ferry. John Brown was a white man who hated slavery from the outside passionately. Frederick Douglass was a black man who had experience from the inside and knew that if you're going to get rid of it, you're going to literally have to kill not just a few, but a lot of people. As it turned out, nearly 1 million of them in a thing called the Civil War. During Reconstruction, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were passed. The 13th Amendment effectively was supposedly supposed to abolish slavery. But there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that said you could not be held to do something against your will unless you were duly convicted of a crime. So very quickly, Southerners began passing laws called vagrancy laws, such that if you're a black man in South Carolina or a black man in Louisiana or Mississippi and you don't have a job, you can be arrested and tried and sent to prison for 6 months or a year. Since you're not going to be allowed to just stand around and get 3 hots in a cot, they'll put you out there on a chain gang working for the local railroad or the mining company or the lumber company. Now, the lumber company pays the state a fee for the labor you're doing. You're not there voluntarily. You're not being compensated. Can I ask you all a question? What is it called when you're made to do something you don't want to do, you're not getting paid money for it? What's it called? Slavery. That perpetuated from the end of the Civil War, 1877, all the way up to 1948. That is the middle of the 20th century. Let me put a fine point on it. The middle of the 20th century, after we had fought not 1, but 2 world wars, and had discovered atomic weapons. The 14th Amendment was supposed to deal with civil rights, due process, equal protection of the laws, dual citizenship. You are a citizen of the state in which you're born and of the nation to which that state belongs. The 15th Amendment dealt with the vote. Sadly, the 15th Amendment gave only black men the right to vote. Women would have to wait until the 20th century. But something happened on the way to the 20th century, to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. When it came to the 13th Amendment, I've tried to explain to you how Southerners got around that. With the 14th Amendment, there were a bunch of laws that began showing up in court. For example, the Supreme Court weighed in on one law after another that said, you know what? When we talked about civil rights, we didn't actually mean civil rights as in all things being equal and being shared spaces. As long as they were equal, they could be legally separated, establishing the principles of separate but equal pretty much became the standard for how we do things into the 20th century. The case that really exemplified that was 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, when Homer Plessy, an octoroon, that is a person who's 1/8 black, was riding the wrong railway car in Louisiana, got kicked off the train, got kicked into the black section, and took his case to court. It was thrown out, he appealed it, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that as long as the facilities are equal, they can be legally separated, establishing the principle of separate but equal that'll last from 1896 all the way up to 1954, Brown v. Board. That is, from the end of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. So these amendments were either violated, denied, ignored. And as far as the vote was concerned, Southerners were never serious about actually obeying that law. Called Southerners many things, but never called them stupid. They understood early on that the way back to power was going to be through the ballot box. So they set about making sure they could get control of that first and foremost. Folk, it's not an accident that we're still fighting about voting today. That's where the power lies. And it turns out that they had an effective weapon to help them get control of the ballot box. The Ku Klux Klan of Reconstruction was actually founded in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. It started off as just kind of like a gentleman's club for bored ex-Confederate soldiers, but very quickly became the terror arm of Southern segregationists. And when I say terror, I don't mean as in some type of mild form of terror or some type of domestic form that we shouldn't take it seriously. I'm talking about terrorism on the level with Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or any other terrorist organization that you know of. And the Ku Klux Klan, those inside and those outside of it, took direct aim at African American suffrage. And then, by the time you get to 1877, for the small progress that was made during Reconstruction, somehow it just vanished. By the time you get to the 20th century, black people have been pushed to the margins, voting has been curtailed, denied, or abolished altogether, effectively. Civil rights are a joke. The 13th Amendment is being replayed through chain gang prison labor and other various forms of peonage, sharecropping, and other forms of keeping people on the economic margins. So the 20th century arrives where Reconstruction having been a 12-year experiment where some major progress was done, but evaporated just as quickly. And with the arrival of the 20th century, a big lie that preceded the big lie was told in 1915 when D. W. Griffith produced the movie Birth of a Nation. This movie told a story of Reconstruction that was, to put it simply, not true. And it also speaks to the fact of what can happen when someone else controls the narrative of history. In Birth of a Nation, D. W. Griffith tells the story in 1915 of out-of-control black soldiers, black Union soldiers who are running amok. They're corrupt, they're stuffing ballot boxes, they're hiding behind trees, they're lusting after young white women, they're doing all kinds of things. They're being a menace to society. And just in case there's not enough irony in life, the guy that played the role of Gus, the black African-American Union soldier, was actually a white guy in blackface, Walter Long on the left. Now, in one very famous scene, Gus tells this woman that now that he's been promoted to captain, he wants to get married. Well, it's 1915. D. W. Griffith was not an idiot. D. W. Griffith made movies that he knew people would like and would feel good about. And he played into every stereotype that was strong in the country at that point. So she, of course, was horrified at the idea of marrying this black Union soldier. It takes off running, terrified. He is determined to have her. He chases after her. She gets to the top of a mountain and threatens to jump if he doesn't stop. He doesn't stop, so she jumps to her death. Little does he know is that one of her relatives is an ex-Confederate officer who is distraught and wonders, what can we do about this menace in society that is causing things to be so upset? They're out of control. We told them that if slavery went away, that life would never be the same, and it hasn't been. Then they discover, somebody remembers that, they are supposed to be afraid of ghosts. What happens if the dead ghost of Confederate soldiers comes back to take care of this problem? And so in Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan ends up being this organization that arrives on the scene and becomes the hero organization that brings peace and order, stability, and safety back to the South. In 1915, that same year that Birth of a Nation came out, in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where there was an etching of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, and Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, Lee's right-hand man during the Civil War. All three of them up there at Stone Mountain, Georgia. A local Ku Klux Klan chapter went out there and they rebirthed the Ku Klux Klan, which frankly had been losing numbers and was almost out of existence. Why? Because they had already won the culture wars. Black folks weren't voting. They were being lynched to the tune of about 150 a year. Intimidation, harassment, violence, and murder was running amok. They got the message, and people had pulled back and knew their place. So in 1915, the modern-day Ku Klux Klan was reborn. By 1920, it spread across the country, particularly to the state of Indiana. I still don't know why Indiana, more than any other state, more than Mississippi, more than Alabama, more than Georgia, more than Florida, more than Virginia, more than North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, more than any other southern state, Indiana had more Ku Klux Klansmen in that state than any other state in the Union. And by the 1920s, there were demonstrations of Ku Klux Klansmen marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Yes, that building you see in the background is the Capitol building, also known as the People's House. the House of Representatives, and the Senate of the United States. You know, the Senate, the world's greatest and most esteemed deliberative body. Now, when I look at that picture, the first time I saw this picture, I looked at this and I said to myself one thing. If that's the people's house, do the people inside the people's house know what's going on outside the people's house? In other words, do they know that a domestic terrorist organization is marching down Pennsylvania Avenue? Because if they know, I can only conclude one thing, that they know that terrorists are marching outside, and they either know this and they're either powerless to do something about it, or they know this and they don't mind. Either way, it sends a message to the people marching that it's okay to march. And if in fact the people who are doing the marching are terrorists, and they are, and the people inside the people's house know that, then the people who sent them to the people's house also are okay with the people marching down Pennsylvania Avenue as well. They marched in 1925. They marched throughout the 1920s. That kind of violence, that kind of terrorism is what led to the Black Wall Street at Tulsa, Oklahoma being burned to the ground. Where on May 31st through June 1st, 1921, that community called the Black Wall Street, which had the highest per capita income of African Americans anywhere in the country, there was a black man named Dick Rowland who got on board, who got on an elevator, either one with a young white woman to go up a couple of flights of steps. By the time he got off, something had happened. He allegedly had tried to assault her. Well, that was all that the Tulsa community needed. From May 31st through June 1st, people that had businesses, churches, homes, clubs, chorale groups, they were run out of town, burned to the ground. In some cases, they were bombed from the air. This is the United States of America. We're not talking about World War I, the Balkans area. We're talking about American citizens who had their homes bombed from the air as airplanes flew over. They dropped burning turpentine balls on the roof to have these things catch on fire. The United States of America. The problem was this. African Americans in the Black Wall Street, the highest per capita income group of African Americans in the country, they were succeeding economically and becoming educated and literate and erudite and elegant and driving nice cars and having nice homes, in spite of the fact that they were living in a Jim Crow society that was doing everything it could to make sure they did the complete opposite. But because they were not walking around as mouth-breathing, knuckle-dragging morons, beating the system in spite of itself, a great deal of anxiety and jealousy built up in Tulsa until they looked for the false flag to go rampaging through there and reducing it to poverty. My mentor here, Bill Cohen, who mentored me when I first got here, Bill had a mentor named John Hope Franklin whose father was in the Black Wall Street. Later on, August 7th, 1930, outside the courthouse, Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp were lynched. When this mob gathered that night, and you can see that it's not so much, when I talk about this, the story that's going on here is not so much Abe Smith and Tommy Shipp. Their earthly journey's over with, they're done, they have no more worries. The real narrative going on here is in the people who are standing in the photo. The people who are looking into the eye of the camera beneath two dead bodies. You've got a double homicide that's been committed here, and people are looking to the eye of the camera, and they do not show any sign of being worried at all that somebody should be accused of committing a double homicide. And the question that I had when I first saw this is, how do they know that it's okay to do that? What told them in their code? What's going on in America on August 7th, 1930 that tells them it's okay to have two dead bodies that you just murdered, and they gather for a family photo to take a picture of that, and then in one person's case, kind of wave hide the camera. Folk appear to be laughing, having a good time. What's going on in America where this happens and people know that it's all right and you can get away with it? Could it be a culture of impunity where you have done it before and again and again and again, and it may happen yet again and again and again? What's the consequence of no consequences? When people do things and they're not held to the law. More injustice, more perpetuation of that culture of impunity. You see, because that injustice and culture of impunity eventually caught up to the state of Michigan in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there was an organization called the Black Legion, which the Black Legion was founded because the founder thought that the Ku Klux Klan was not being radical enough in its persecution of black people, Catholics, immigrants, and other non-desirables. So yes, they dressed up in these black pirate suits with the skull and crossbones, and please don't let the ridiculousness of the skull and crossbones somehow distract or deter from the fact that these characters were very, very lethal, very, very dangerous. They were founded by a dentist named Dr. William Shepard, who lived in Southern Ohio. Now, Dr. William Shepard, there's a lot of talk these days about critical race theory. We don't want people knowing the truth about slavery and the antebellum period and the Civil War and Reconstruction. Don't tell that part. Well, Dr. Shepard grew up on these stories about the Old South when it was black folks out there in the fields picking cotton and singing. They must have been happy because they were singing. And he had all these romanticized notions about what the Old South was like, and he went around visiting Civil War battlefields and reading all this lost cause narrative, which essentially led him to believe that the Civil War had turned out the wrong way, Reconstruction had been an absolute failure and disaster, and he thought that the Ku Klux Klan, even though it was trying to right Reconstruction, wasn't doing a good enough job, so he founded the Black Legion to make sure it was done right. The Black Legion targeted Jews. The Black Legion targeted Catholics. The Black Legion targeted immigrants. The Black Legion targeted, of course, black people. This is not all of it, but some of the lines of the oath, the way you joined the Black Legion, and you really didn't join, you had to be sponsored. Someone would see you were a good candidate, they'd take you out, unbeknownst to you, they'd take you out to a wooded area, secluded area, put a gun to your head, and have you recite the oath. Do you believe in white supremacy and that no Negro should have authority over a white man? If you listen close enough, there'll be a slight echo to some of the rhetoric we've heard in the 21st century. Do you believe in restricted immigration and deportation of all undesirable aliens? Would you oppose by ballot, and if necessary by force, of arms any attempt to place any portion of the public tax money in the hands of the Roman Catholic Church? If it ever should become necessary to lie to protect a member of this organization, would you do so if ordered by your superior officers? What is your attitude toward lynch law and entitlement to violence? Are you properly armed? Do you own a revolver, rifle, or shotgun? If not, will you arm yourself as soon as possible? These are just some of the questions that somebody had to answer the correct way to become eligible to join the Black Legion. The tipping point for this organization came on May 12, 1936, with a gentleman named Charles Poole. Now, Charles Poole, handsome guy, young guy, had a young family, was a Catholic. He worked for one of the Roosevelt administration's, New Deal programs called the Works Progress Administration. Now, it turns out that Charles Poole, the Catholic, was married to a Protestant woman named Becky. And the Black Legion, being the self-appointed protectors of American purity and democracy, heard that Charles Poole, the Catholic, was beating up on his Protestant wife, who at the same time happened to be pregnant too. Well, these self-appointed guardians of purity and chastity and Americanism were not going to stand for a Catholic beating up on a Protestant woman, so they decided to teach Charles Poole a lesson. They took him out to a wooded area and murdered him. Now, this is just about a year or two after they'd gone to a black guy in Detroit, because they were very heavy around the Detroit area, and one of the Black Legion leaders told one of the lieutenants, I need you to go out and find me a black guy. And he said, well, who? He said, anyone. I just want to know what it feels like to shoot one. So when they found a random black guy, they lured him out to the woods, telling him that they were going to give some back pay. It was the Depression. And anybody who had back pay coming into the Depression was going to take it. They got him out there, lured him out there. They shot him once. He started running through the woods. They chased him like he was a deer running for his life. They hunted him down and murdered him. These characters are bad news. Now, it turns out that one of them, having realized that Charles Poole had not been beating his wife, not that there was any of their business anyway was going on in their marriage, he turned himself in, and then when it broke in the news, The authorities were all over this, and one of those rare instances, the Black Legion leaders were arrested, they were tried, most of them sent to jail for life. In doing some research on this, I found out that Becky Poole, not only was she Protestant, but it turns out that she had an African-American great-great-grandmother. So I guess my point is this. James Madison was right. Men are not angels, that's for sure. So therefore, government is necessary, very necessary. And we have had a bad habit of coexisting by making a space for tyranny inside of our democracy. When people in the community of the Black Wall Street can just literally have their homes bombed and torn up and run out of town, when people can essentially have their citizenship denied, even though they're American citizens, I can't help but sometimes make comparisons to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, where Jews were just written out of their citizenship with the stroke of a pen, or Kristallnacht in November 1938, when people had their synagogues and homes bombed and burned out. I tell people sometimes, my sisters and friends back in the DC area, be very careful about how you feel about immigration, because immigration, dual citizenship, was a function of the post-Civil War Reconstruction amendments. In 1865, there were 4 million Black people in this country. They didn't parachute in. They didn't sneak across the border. They had been born in the United States, but they previously had been property. So what were you going to do with them? They weren't citizens before, just a few days before they had been property. So that's why they put the language in the amendment that said you are a citizen of the state in which you reside or born in, and also the nation to which the state belongs. The culture of impurity, I suggest, impunity, is in part. Michigan has had a long, long history of militia units and people that thought they just were entitled to mob violence and entitled to do things and could get away with it. And I can't help but just believe that they did this because they had before. This is a rare instance where an attempt to do something like this, maybe it was because they're trying to kidnap a chief executive of a state. They're being held accountable finally. And then the entitlement to mob violence and having gotten away with it for so long, I think in part is what motivated what happened on January 6, 2021, in response to the big lie. And depending upon how all that shakes out, we may see more injustice. And so, because these things have happened, and because we're not out of the woods yet, I don't think, we need to pay heed to the warning from the first president. In his farewell address, George Washington said, "In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations. Already in 1796, people were starting to make distinctions between North, South, East, and West. The regions of the country were becoming more important to people than the nation itself. Northern and Southern, Atlantic and Western, where designing men, that is, men who have ambition, may endeavor to excite a belief, that is, to stir people up with the belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. In other words, we're not all Americans. You're a Southerner, you're a Northerner, you're from the Northeast, you're from the West. Where you live becomes more important than the nation you belong to. Let me put it to you this way. When Robert E. Lee was asked to take command of the Union Army at the start of the Civil War, he responded not by saying, I can't take control of the army. He said, I cannot fight against my country. When he said that, he was talking about the state of Virginia, not the United States of America. He identified with his state, not the nation. One of the expedients of party, George Washington was deathly afraid of the rise of political parties because of the factionalism, the polarization that they inherently would involve. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. That is, they'll lie. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. In other words, we allow ourselves to get distracted by elements of class, race, gender, orientation, you name it, instead of finding common cause in a unified American nation. But then he said something even more. Toward the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite, it is required, I implore you, not only that you steadily discountenance irregular oppositions to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation. That is, there are going to always be out there people who will be looking for a way, innovation, trying to devise new methods of getting at you, however specious the pretext, telling lies, no matter how implausible they are, to erode this Republican democracy. One method of assault may be to effect in the forms of the Constitution, that is, to use the Constitution, listen closely, one method may be to use the Constitution, alterations which will impair the energy of the system to deprive the political system of its natural dynamic energy, and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. In other words, hollow it out from the inside, cause it to collapse on the inside rather than overthrow it from the outside. We are much more capable of fending off external attacks than being strong inside. The guardrails have been weakened over the last few years. The center is held, but that is no reason to suddenly not be vigilant. How is it, I wonder, in 1796 that George Washington knew that someday an attack would come from the inside and warned us against this? Again, when people talk about George Washington's farewell address, they talk about foreign entanglements. We should not get involved in Europe's affairs because the Europeans have been at this stuff for a long time. They were good at it. They were wily. They were slick. They knew how to do diplomacy. We were a young nation. We simply couldn't take that chance. He was right. They're still good at it. They're still better at it than we are. But as far as the internal stuff, that is not to say that we should not be on the lookout for people who will try to hollow us out, to weaken us from the inside. If it doesn't come from the outside, you can guarantee there'll be those with a spirit of innovation who will be trying one way or another. When they fail here, they'll try over there. But they're always going to be probing, trying to find a weak spot to get into that area, to take it down from the inside. When I was an undergrad at Bowie State College in Maryland, I would go downtown to do research at the National Archives very often, take the subway downtown and come up. And then when I walked through the National Archives, I would always stop. Every time I would stop and just look at this and read this and just contemplate what this meant. You see, growing up in the South, when I did, coming from outside the United States, I looked at the country. Still, I see the country not as much as I used to, but somewhat through the eyes of somebody as an immigrant coming to the United States and looking at American democracy from the outside, but also as one experiencing it from the inside. I spent the first half of my life in the Philippines, so I knew how America looked from the outside and was proud of it from the outside, and I would wonder about this and the inconsistencies that I was experiencing as a Southerner in Maryland. Internal vigilance is the price of liberty. What does that mean? I still ask myself whenever I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm driving past this. This means, I think, that there's not one moment of a second, of any hour, of any day that you can afford to not be vigilant. The democracy is not going to maintain itself. The democracy is not guaranteed to perpetuate or last. It will be as strong as we are. It will be as good as we choose to be or not. It will do the things that the people allow it to do, and for the people that get away with stuff, it's because we allowed them to get away with it. I'm teaching a class on the Civil War at the Muskegon Correctional Facility, and one of my best friends back home, I'm talking about him with this, he said, well, do you know what they're in there for? The inmates? And I said, no, I don't know what they're in there for. I got 24 of them in this class. We don't talk about what they're in there for. All I care about is that these are men who have decided to do something with their lives, and they're going at education. They're trying to do something when they get out so they can make something of themselves. I don't know how they missed it the first time. They're doing it right now. That's all I care about. So the next question was, well, how do you know they're not guilty? I said, I don't know that. I said, but let me tell you this much. Here's what I do know. Of the 24 of them, not one of them tried to overthrow the government. Not one. The consequence of no consequences means that we're going to get more of the same, I believe. There are dangers ahead, I believe. What's at stake is that there are people out there who are probing, election deniers, who want to undo this thing. And I come to this conclusion that it doesn't matter what your pet project is, if it's the climate, if it's race, if it's gender, whatever it is, and all those things are important. But all of that only matters if you have a democracy that's available to have the debate about any of that stuff. If the democracy goes, all the rest of it's gone, because the people that are trying to undo this thing, they don't care about any of that. They're in it for power's sake, for themselves. So if you want the agenda of yours to be heard, it's got to happen within the framework of a Republican democracy with good civil discourse, where these kind of things can be had. Choose your own hobby horse and go at it. But we need a democracy to have the debate. That's the first priority. And I do believe it is a clear and present danger. We've been warned by the president, the first one. Thanks. The question is, what happened to the Black Legion after the death of Charles Poole? They pretty much fell out of favor and disbanded. Now, if you're interested, Humphrey Bogart made early in his film career, he made a movie called The Black Legion, which of course is Hollywood, which means it's over-dramatized, but it does show a good representation of who these guys were. And there's a scene where they take a guy out to the woods and put a gun to his head and make him swear the oath and all that business. But they essentially, it was such a scandal. And it turns out that there are people, I don't know if it was Flint, it was one of the nearby communities in Detroit, near Detroit, where there were members of the Black Legion who were part of the fire department, the police force, and the city council. So they infiltrated, the halls of government as well. And as I mentioned to people all the time, yeah, they wear those funny robes and they wear, the skull and crossbones. They may look funny, but they're there to be taken seriously because it doesn't matter how crazy I think they are serious about their bigotry. And they follow through on it, which is why we cannot afford to dismiss them. So they fell apart, essentially. The Klan did not. The Ku Klux Klan has had 3 iterations. One, the Klan of Reconstruction that was founded in 1866. The second one that was founded in 1915. And then the third one that saw the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan with the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. We're still in the afterglow of that one. Next.
You speak of the consequence of no consequences.
Yes.
And then have you been watching the hearings regarding the January 6th insurrection? Do you feel like there is sort of progress being made towards putting consequences on that type of mob violence? Or do you feel like we're stuck in the same type of rhetorics that we've had for centuries? I
think that what they're doing with the January 6th committee is that they're showing, first off, the depth of the rot and how dangerously close we came. So that part is necessary and is good. It's going to become like the 9/11 Commission, part of the historical record that we'll be able to work through and get more information more and more as time goes on. And there are people who are being prosecuted. So there are some who are being prosecuted and being held accountable for storming the Capitol. The real question is, will the chief perpetrators be held accountable? The ones that enabled it and made it possible. Because it's one thing to say we're a nation of laws and not men and women. So if we are, then let's be that way. If we're not, then let's tell the truth and just get used to living the reality that we're in. I prefer a nation of laws and no one being above the law. Kathleen?
What do you think was the lasting effect of the Obama presidency?
My interpretation of the Obama presidency was that, first off, I remember the night that Obama got elected, that he actually won the electoral vote count. Because so that same year I had my own campaign headquarters over at the City View restaurant, and we were counting up the votes. And they announced we had one Holland City, we had one Muskegon County, never been done before. And my campaign staff was looking for me. They were calling me on the phone, and where are you? Things are going our way. I didn't do anything as far as going to the celebration because there were people who were pulling to the parking lot, and I was listening to the conversations, Kathleen, and they were saying, like, isn't it wonderful that we finally got our first black president? And I said, yes, it's wonderful. But I stood there in the shadows between the building and a dumpster, thinking to myself, is this a good thing? Now, on the one hand, I never expected to see it in my lifetime, so it was a good thing. But I knew that evening, where there were millions of people who were celebrating, there were millions more who were not. So I think that what happened, and this was not something people wanted to hear in 2020. When we were going through all those candidates who were running, I said, the country needs to elect somebody who, even if they disagree with his politics, he looks like what they're used to seeing in leadership, okay? And I think that what has happened is that Obama was, for me, the culmination of what I call the third Reconstruction. We've had three. The first Reconstruction from 1865 to 77, the third one from 1954 to 68, King's assassination, the third one that we're in the midst of right now, which would be from 2008 moving forward, because every Reconstruction has been characterized by this: a great amount of progress and then snap back. Then a great amount of progress. The second one had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, affirmative action signed by Nixon in 1973, and it all is undone just as fast as it's implemented. And so Obama's presidency, demographically, people were told that this process called the browning of America was not supposed to begin taking place until the year 2050. Or if a black man could become president of the United States in 2008, for many people that was 42 years ahead of schedule. They've been reacting to that ever since. Or as we say down in Virginia, they've been on a tear. So I think that a lot of what you've seen, and I wonder sometimes about the current environment. It's been happening for a long time. It didn't just come, very recently or just all like that. It's been a building kind of crisis in gathering momentum. But I just wonder sometimes, I think the ghost of John McCain must be smiling these days. Because you remember that time when McCain, how the lady that said Obama's not a citizen, he's a Muslim and all this stuff, and McCain took the microphone away from her. He said, no, he's a good man. We have differing views on politics, but he's a good American citizen. Well, the narrative of the woman that wanted to push that is what's dominating the airways right now. I don't know how loud they are, what the numbers are, but I think that maybe a sea change is underway. We're in the midst of the third Reconstruction as I see it. Peg.
What is the situation of the Ku Klux Klan today?
What is the situation of the Ku Klux Klan in Michigan today? They're still here. When I first got to Hope, Dr. David Schock and Dr. Schock was in the communications department, and he had gotten a McGregor Foundation grant. We were going to do a 4-part documentary series on the Ku Klux Klan. And quite frankly, sometimes I wish I had never signed on to that project with him, because I found out more than I wish that I knew. They have been up in Muskegon. They have been in Caledonia, out in the Grand Rapids. We found pictures of the Ku Klux Klan marching down major streets in Grand Rapids. You visit Dr. David Pilgrim up there at Ferris State University. The actual and online Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, they're here. And quite honestly, sometimes, I've said that the further north you go, people call it going up north, I call it going up south. You find Confederate flags and all kinds of things going on. There's a celebration of the Klan. So they're there. I mean, they're still, I don't think it's dense as Indiana. I had an African-American female student about 6-7 years ago told me, she said that when she went home to Indianapolis, or she had to drive south on I-65, she said she prayed to God. There were certain towns where she prayed her car would not break down because the Ku Klux Klan presence in Indiana is still so prevalent. She was literally frightened for her life to have a car break down. That's in the 21st century. So there was one instance, and I just put it out there. When I was campaigning in Cadillac, I told my campaign staff to never send me back up there again. They would send me up there knocking on doors. The evil and hatred I felt coming at me in Cadillac, I said, I've been in racist towns in the South. I remember going across the Alabama state line seeing the billboard that had the Ku Klux Klansmen on it saying, "Welcome to Alabama," when I was a kid. But I have never, like Martin Luther King Jr. said when he went to Chicago, said he had been in Mississippi, in Alabama, and Georgia. He said he never saw anything, the racism like he saw in Chicago. I never felt anything like I felt in Cadillac. So I told my campaign staff, I said, I don't care if I lose every vote in that town. I'm not going back ever again. So the spirit of them is there, and they're still there. A number of years ago, one of my students, God bless his heart, he brought to me, he said, "Hey, Professor Johnson, I got this card from a guy, Ku Klux Klansman out in Caledonia. If you want to have it." Well, why do you think I want to have this? Well, he's given it to me, just as proof of what's going on out there. So I've had different instances which lets me know that they're more near than far. A number of years ago, Dr. Shaka, again, when he was still working on that project, there was a Klan Nazi gathering in 2004 in Kalamazoo. The issue then, I forgot what the issue was then, but they gathered there, and it wasn't so much Kalamazoo, but because they heard something, I know what it was. Black people were running amok in Kalamazoo, committing crime, and the cops, were on the ropes. And so all these different outside groups came in to help restore order. So the Nazis came, the Neo-Confederates came, the Klan came, and Shock has them on film. I got a DVD copy that he made in my office, and it's just, to see these people in brown shirts and swastikas in 2004 in the 21st century in a town an hour from here it'll make you think. It'll make you think.
Other than voting, what is a concrete action that citizens not in the fields of public policy or law can take?
Other than voting?
Yeah.
Andrew, I would say that we all have our own private spaces, and that when you know how they say in schools about gun shootings, if you see something, say something. If you see something or hear somebody saying something that you know is untoward or is going to be contradictory to the kind of democracy I think we're trying to have, say something. It's good if you have position to do that. But I think we have to do this on a day-by-day basis, on a moment-by-moment basis, because it's eroding and corroding on a day-by-day, moment-by-moment basis. Okay? Andy?
First, Professor Johnson, congratulations on attaining full
Thank you.
professor. It strikes me, your use of the word entitlement was important in your talk. It strikes me that sometimes I would think about that 2004 event, that the people that gathered there would think that they were justified in gathering there to respond to the perceived police problem. How do we, in our complicated social milieu right now, think through how to explain, I would hope truthfully, and in a way helpfully to our democracy, the difference between, what is really justified, what is entitlement, and those kinds of issues, especially with regards to narrative, because they're really an important question. People are using words to say these kinds of things.
As you're speaking, Andy, I'm thinking about there's a very, well, I don't know how famous this is, but there's a widely distributed picture of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale on the steps of the California State Capitol in 1968. They're standing there with rifles. They're part of the Black Panthers, right? And in 1966 in Watts, there are people who are saying, like, look, we have no job opportunities here, no good decent housing, no good child care, with no first aid, so we'll do it ourselves. To include policing the neighborhoods, because the police weren't coming to the neighborhoods. So they got weapons, they policed their own neighborhood. Well, when people saw Bobby Seale and Huey Newton standing on the steps, two black men wearing berets and sunglasses, leather jackets, with their weapons, exercising their Second Amendment rights, they were apoplectic. Okay? So when we use the word entitlement, what comes along with that is trying to figure out, well, who's entitled to do what? Because if you're entitled to carry weapons that have Second Amendment rights, then It's just like in the old debate about, which was a bizarre debate all by itself, crack versus cocaine, powder cocaine, different sentencing structures for both of those, and those kind of things. One's a heavier sentence, but falls on a certain community. And believe me, this is not an endorsement for either one of them, but it's just drawing the distinction between that there seems to be entitlement over here for one type and not so much over here. And those are the kind of things that run through my mind on Friday mornings when I'm up at the facility. I got 24 men in that class, 2 white guys, 3 Latinos, and 19 black men. And I'm wondering, how does this work out? And we're only 12% of the population. So you're right, in the social milieu, it's very difficult to figure out where the entitlement is, but I think it goes back to the question about how do we hold people accountable? And entitlement can be diminished if people are confident that the law is going to be equally applied. That's the first thing. Once you realize that the law is being equally applied, then you can get people's confidence that there are no entitlements, that when you do something, that one punishment A will be punishment B, or accountability A will be accountability B, and the only entitlement you get is the one that is the legal kind, right? But when you have that kind of inequity in the justice system, there's going to constantly be questions about that. Daniel.
You mentioned in your presentation that our democracy moves through time, through progress and snapbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see the January 6th insurrection as the beginning of a snapback, or do you see the hearings and people beginning to be held accountable as a breakthrough point for further progress?
I don't think it was a snapback so much, Daniel, as it was a wake-up call. I mean, I know people, you all know your people in your private circles. I know people who sincerely believe that it just couldn't happen here. And then it did. Now it has. So the only question that I have right now is that now that we know that it can happen here, what do we do about it? Or do we actually put guardrails in place? The guardrails we had in place are insufficient to stop something like that. My heart breaks every time I go home to D.C. because now to see certain monuments, they have the concrete barricades up. Traffic is channelized. It used to be you could walk to National Airport and go up on the observation deck and look at airplanes taking off and landing and whatnot. You can't do that anymore. So we have made all these modifications to be more secure, but in becoming more secure, it has taken away at least some of the freedom that I used to have going to D.C. and visiting different monuments and sites that were unencumbered. But now there's check-ins and barricades and safety devices and metal detectors. Well, are we going to let the people who make us have those things win? Or are we going to sit there and restore things so that it's the people's democracy for real? So I think the takeaway is that it's happened. It can happen here. The democracy is fragile. People have known it's been fragile all along. It's very fragile, and we now know it can be lost. And the mere fact that it can be lost, and there are people who are willing to see it lost and are willing to see it be lost. Herman Wouk, in his second book, War and Remembrance, the follow-on to The Winds of War, there's a German general in there telling the story about, he's asking, one of his general colleagues said to him, they're on the Russian front, and they're just having a casual conversation. They're thinking about the days when Hitler rose to power, and the guy says to the other one, well, why didn't the Jews leave when they saw that it was clearly getting bad for them? And the guy says, I think it's called the will to not believe. It said the will to not believe, that is, you can see a thing in front of you with your own eyes and know that it's bad, but it is so, the possibility of what it could be is so unbelievable, the mind simply cannot comprehend or refuses to accept the possibility of what could happen. And for those individuals, when it finally got to be too late, it was too late for them to, then they couldn't leave. The will to not believe, when it comes to the big lie, the will to believe. We had to be vigilant. We got to be on standby. We had to strengthen things that are weak. And we cannot ignore the threat. I'm sorry, you all. I wanted this to be a happier talk, but I guess it's not. Go ahead, Daniel. Go ahead.
I just had a follow-up. So do you believe that being vigilant, understanding that this can happen to us specifically, is a huge impotence for our democracy moving forward? As there was a writing, I can't recall it entirely. It was about the Nazi regime, and it was this author who stated that first they came for the Jews, then they came for the communists, and then they came for me.
Martin Niemöller, yeah. It can happen. It can happen. Listen, I'll tell you what I told my sister, okay? I told my sister after the January 6th riot, I said, you know what? I said, I've always figured they were coming after us. I've always known that. But now they're coming after everybody else. Now I'm going to see for real. I've always known they were coming after people in my community, if they got the chance, because they have. But now they're coming after the government, the Capitol. So it was casually assumed that they come after me, well, that won't be important enough because it hasn't been. But when they're coming after the Constitution, that's different. Maybe now they'll respond. If there's no response now, I don't know. Then I have worries. I'm worried now, I have even bigger worries. Kathleen. No, I did not mention him on purpose. Okay. Thank you.